And I'm thrilled to see so many of you here today. I did notice as I walked in that the poster outside just says Simone de Beauvoir, so I may have to tell some of you I'm not Simone de Beauvoir, just in case. But in any case, I will just go straight for it. You're supposed to have a handout. That's just, you don't have to have it, it's just helpful for the flow of the thing. The first section of my talk, as you will see from the handout, is the essential elements of her genius. So this is the 62nd mastermind lecture, but only the second on a woman. The one woman to be judged worthy of a mastermind lecture before Simone de Beauvoir, who lived from 1908 to 1986, we should note here, is George Eliot, who happens to have been the very young Simone's favorite author. Reading The Mill on the Floss as a teenager, Beauvoir identified intensely both with the heroine and the author. One day, she told herself, another adolescent girl would bathe with her tears a novel in which I would tell my own story, unquote. Beauvoir's own work began when she became capable of dispelling such juvenile fantasies. I don't mean that she stopped admiring George Eliot, the Mandarins surely owe something to Middlemarch, but she discovered that one can't write well if one writes simply in order to be a writer. You write so that someone can bathe with tears your own image, not the right motivation, Beauvoir realized. To write seriously, one must have something to say. Was Beauvoir a mastermind? Does she deserve inclusion among the great thinkers of mankind? Many would hotly deny it. As Nancy Bauer has pointed out, to this day, much writing about Beauvoir, even by feminists, is dripping with condescension. As long as she lived, Beauvoir had to put up with belittling responses to her life and works. The French press was particularly fond of denying her claims to intellectual seriousness, let alone greatness, by referring to her as a midinette, an empty-headed shop girl. For over 20 years, the Larousse Encyclopedia presented her as, the entry read, Simone de Beauvoir, woman of letters, Sartre's disciple. When she died, a French right-wing journalist wrote that she had been nothing but a little dog peeing on Sartre's trousers. Shop girls, disciples, and dogs are usually not acknowledged as masterminds. We should be grateful that the British Academy this year contributes to the collective task of erasing the sexism that still shadows Beauvoir's legacy by including her on its list of masterminds. A mastermind lecturer is asked to appraise, you have the whole, I'm going to come back to the mastermind lectures, but you have the whole info on them on the handout. But to give a mastermind lecture, you are asked to, quote, appraise the essential elements of the mastermind's genius. In the case of Beauvoir, this is not easy. She was an extremely wide-ranging writer and intellectual, the author of two absolutely masterly novels, namely L'Invité and The Mandarins, 3 other novels, and 1 collection of short stories. And I've given you the titles of most of her works, the key ones on the handout. Beauvoir's memoirs are considered some of the most important in 20th century French literature. She also wrote many philosophical essays, the greatest of which is The Second Sex. After the war, she became an outspoken public intellectual with an immense international reputation. Both her writing and her existential choices made her a role model for a whole generation of intelligent young women. Just as Beauvoir read George Eliot, they read Beauvoir and identified with her. One might argue that The Second Sex alone is enough to make Beauvoir a mastermind. This pioneering book analyzed the oppression of women in a radically new way. The only other text of similar clarity and achievement in the first half of the 20th century is Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, but Woolf's essay, as beautiful and important as it is, limits itself to literature. It lacks the philosophical energy and scope, the ability to rethink women's condition from the ground up that we find in the second sex. One reason for this difference is that Woolf, who was born in 1882, was excluded from higher education. You know, all the essays Woolf writes about women's, how she was not allowed to learn Greek, how she was not allowed to go to university, and so on. Whereas Beauvoir, who was born in 1908, belonged to the first generation of European women to gain access to institutions of higher education on an equal footing with men. When she studied at the Sorbonne in the late 1920s, almost 30% of the students were women. And in fact, that's a percentage that stayed the same in Western European universities until the 1960s. 1/3 were women until the 60s explosion of students. So what holds Beauvoir's oeuvre together? What are the essential elements of her genius? Well, to me, the path to an answer begins with a line from the preface to her collection of essays called L'existentialisme et la sagesse des nations, where she writes, "In truth, there is no divorce between philosophy and life." So, in truth, there is no divorce between philosophy and life. Beauvoir began to write because she wanted to understand her own experiences. Already as a student, she took philosophy to be a way of life, not just an academic exercise. She lived her ideas and thought her feelings. When she was 18, she wrote that, and I'm quoting her student diaries, "I put reason into my feelings and my spontaneity into my ideas." Ruminating on the differences between herself and Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who was her fellow student, good friend from early student years, she noted that those problems that he lives in his mind, I live with my arms and legs. Looking back on her life in all said and done, Beauvoir writes that my freedom was the carrying through of an initial project, that's a projet originel, as the existentialists called it, continually resumed and strengthened, the project of knowing and of expressing. So now we have two threads that I'm trying to build up to this essential genius she has here. On the one hand, this idea that there's no divorce between philosophy and life. And on the other hand, the idea that she is all through her life committed to the project of knowing and expressing. To know and express, this is a project that takes no account of traditional boundaries between genres and disciplines. Beauvoir took for granted that literature and philosophy worked on the same sort of problems, for example, and that these problems were not divorced from ordinary life. She does, in my view, she does philosophical work in her novels and always manages to see the philosophically salient aspects of texts such as literature, memoirs, diaries, and letters. As a result, her works are shining examples of the kind of knowledge that only the humanities and the arts can provide. And I should make a footnote here. We live in a time when the humanities are under various forms of pressure. I think Beauvoir's commitment to knowing and expressing is a fundamental commitment to what the humanities can tell us about the meaning of human life and existence. And that could be another talk, actually. The Second Sex is a masterpiece because it embodies Beauvoir's commitment to knowing and expressing ordinary experience. So here's the sort of master claim of the talk then, that the no divorce between life and philosophy and the wishing to know and the wishing to express come together in all kinds of exemplary fashions in The Second Sex, but also in her novels, which I'm not focusing on in this talk, and not because I don't like them, but because there's not enough time. She began writing The Second Sex because she wanted to understand what it meant to her to be born a woman. Much of the analysis in The Second Sex is based on excerpts from women's fiction, memoirs, letters, and diaries. By quoting such texts frequently and at length, Beauvoir shows us the world as it has looked to women in different situations. But she does more. She also makes us see the philosophical relevance of their experiences and their insights. To her, there truly was no divorce between philosophy and life. So what was her major philosophical and literary preoccupations then? See, now I'm sort of trying to narrow down my topic here, because otherwise I'm going to have to talk about all philosophy, all life, and all literature, and I don't think I quite can cope with that. What exactly was she trying to know and express above all other things, as it were? In an entry in her student diaries, written in July 1927, when she was only 19, she sets out to analyze her own diary so far. So she reads back on her diaries that started when she was about 16, I think. And her conclusion is that, quote, "The theme is almost always this opposition of self and other that I felt when I started to live." As Margaret Simons has pointed out, this commitment to studying the opposition between self and other runs through all her later writing. Whether it is in fiction, memoirs, or philosophy, the question of the other continues to haunt Beauvoir throughout her life. But the question of the other for Beauvoir is also the question of the self. It's crucial to keep these two together, as it were. In the same passage, she goes on to say that I am once again curiously finding myself thinking the same things as last year about this incommunicable self. This is at once a description of Beauvoir's own experience of life at this time. She felt alienated, lonely, cut off from others, and she felt misunderstood, of course. I mean, what 19-year-old does not? And it's an expression of the skeptical idea that the self is fundamentally unknowable and uncommunicable. Her own projet originel can be understood as the effort to overcome that experience, to know and to communicate that self she feared was forever cut off from human community. Now, this is interesting because to understand herself, her initial move, and this is a move that stays with her in all her writing, is to turn to the effort of understanding the other. The implication is, of course, you can't understand yourself if you were the only creature in the world, you would not know who you were. She, in fact, says that at the beginning of the second sex. If you were the only person in the world, you would not know what sex you were either. So the self and the other always intertwined. So therefore, I have decided that in this talk, I will investigate Beauvoir's investigations of otherness, which she conducts across the boundaries of literature and philosophy. I'm doing that partly because it hasn't really been done before, not certainly in the way I'm doing it here. And secondly, because I think her investigations of otherness provide a much needed antidote to the present day tendency to speak of the other or otherness as if it were one monolithic entity, as if there were like one other out there. Regardless of who fills the category, it would be the same. Beauvoir teaches us, and this is part of what I'm going to do in this talk, that there are many different ways of being other to someone else, that not all of them are bad, and that clear thinking requires us to be able to distinguish between kinds of otherness. And I do feel very strongly that the work I'm doing in this talk here is something that could be fleshed out very richly by being compared to other theories of otherness and so on that's going on today. But obviously today we're focusing on Beauvoir. I'll just stay with that. Beauvoir does this by investigating, roughly in chronological order, 4 different types of otherness, which I shall call, and respectively, and you have them on the handout as well, metaphysical otherness, particular otherness, absolute otherness, and reciprocal otherness. So in this lecture, I can only give a relatively brief overview of her explorations of this topic, but at the end of the lecture, I'll spend some time discussing her most famous claim concerning otherness, namely that man is the one, woman is the other, or that's how we normally quote it, but the actual quote in the second sex is, he is the subject, he is the absolute, she is the other. To bring out the power and range of her observation, as well as its capacity to illuminate ordinary experience, I'll ask how it allows us to analyze the situation we are in right now, namely the mastermind lectures themselves. So we'll begin with metaphysical otherness. My understanding of Beauvoir's notion of metaphysical otherness comes from my reading of her novel L'Invité, which I actually gave a talk on here in London last year, so that's why I'm particularly short on this section, but you can ask questions afterwards if you like. Throughout the 1940s, Beauvoir developed her thoughts about the other in literary as well as in philosophical form. Her first novel, L'Invité, or She Came to Stay, is a study of metaphysical otherness. Here, and so what is metaphysical otherness in this context? It means otherness as such, the appearance of the other in its purest generality. In its obsession with otherness, L'Invité stands as a counterpoint to Sartre's nausea, which is equally philosophically obsessed, not with otherness, but with the protagonist's experience of things. So one novel about things invading you, and another novel about others invading you, as it were. In L'Invité, the solipsistic heroine Françoise is essentially uninterested in other people as long as they don't interfere with her own projects. To her, they are puppets, wax figures, not real human beings. They exist, but they're not important. A good example is that her lover Pierre also has other mistresses, but as they're not really real human beings to her, she doesn't mind. At least so she says. Her lover, Pierre, is not an other to her either. As the novel shows, she considers him an extension of herself. Both of them, Pierre and Françoise, constantly repeat their personal motto, on ne fait qu'un, we are one. The novel's conflict begins when Françoise and Pierre invite a young woman, Xavier, to form a trio with them. While Pierre is deeply fascinated with Xavier, Françoise is profoundly ambivalent towards her. At times, she experiences genuine passion for the young woman. At others, she detests and loathes her. As the novel evolves, Françoise experiences the presence of Xavier as an absolutely horrifying otherness which threatens to dissolve her own subjectivity. Beauvoir quite deliberately places Françoise's encounter with otherness beyond or outside questions of ethics, morality, discrimination, oppression, and politics. I'm telling you, those are not issues in this novel. That's why I'm calling it metaphysical otherness, the pure experience of otherness. To Françoise, what matters is the fundamental experience of the other's presence, an experience she finds to annihilate her own self. At the end of the book, and here I'm really sorry, it's a true spoiler alert and it's too late to run away. At the end of the book, Françoise kills Xavier. She has concluded that in her world there can be no others. The very existence of another consciousness will lead to a struggle to the death. No wonder the novel has an epigraph from Hegel, namely, each consciousness seeks the death of the other. In L'Invité, Beauvoir's focus is on what the French phenomenologists at the time called the metaphysical experience of otherness, by which they meant the pure experience of the other on the most fundamental level, a kind of experience that reveals a human being's spontaneous existential attitude towards the other. That means that Françoise, for example, is, you could call her a solipsist, but she's also imperious, dominating, maybe paranoid, and so on. There are words you can find for that. For the phenomenologist, the metaphysical novel's task was to unveil pure existence. Maurice Blanchot praised L'Invité by saying that the essence of the book is not at all the mood or the jealousy of a person. Behind such individual features, there is his naked existence, his existence as free consciousness and elusive power. and Merleau-Ponty, who called L'Invité a metaphysical novel, I think he was the first to label it that, said it was doing the same work as phenomenological philosophy, attempting to capture an experience of the world which precedes all thought about the world. Now that's Merleau-Ponty. Here we could have a fascinating philosophical debate about whether that's even possible. Can you do that? Well, Merleau-Ponty thought so, and he thought furthermore that Beauvoir did it in her novel. So I'll leave it at that here. L'Invité shows that there's a way of living in a world full of fellow creatures without really taking them in, without granting them the status of full subjecthood. It also shows that for someone who has taken up this attitude in life, the discovery of the imperious desires of another can be a horrifying revelation of existence, giving rise to nightmarish fears of annihilation and death. Thus, L'Invité shows that certain kinds of hostility to otherness are fueled by a fear of self-annihilation that may be expressed in violent attempts to kill the other. To be able actually to live with others, however, we need a radically different understanding of otherness. And that brings me to the second section of the second type of otherness, which is called particular others and is based on the little essay called Pyrrhus and Cineas, and could also be based on the novel The Blood of Others, which I think one can learn a lot from. She wrote them mostly at the same time. The impact of World War II, particularly the German occupation of France, made Beauvoir turn away from metaphysics and towards history and politics. The most succinct discussion of her new, situated and historically grounded perspective on the other can be found in the short essay Pyrrhus and Cineas. In this essay, as well as in the novel The Blood of Others, which she was writing at the same time, her question is no longer, how can there be others? Because that's sort of the question of L'Invité. How can there be others in my world, as it were? But here the question is, how to live with others. You realize you can't ask that question unless you granted that there are others in the first place. Beauvoir suggests in Pyrrhus and Cineas that if we remain obsessed with metaphysical otherness, then we simply can't answer the question how to live with others. Instead, we must begin by realizing that others are concrete, situated human beings. We aren't dealing with metaphysics or metaphysical otherness anymore, but with particular others who occupy their own space on Earth. In short, Beauvoir moves from existential annihilation to questions about specific actions and choices, and therefore also to questions about responsibility. One mistake to avoid at all costs, she writes, is to give in to the temptation to pontificate about others in abstract and general terms. For example, by saying things like, all men are my brothers, she writes. Because even if we don't actually use those specific words, the same feeling or the same idea surfaces when we are overcome by some vague idea that we ought to be good or help everyone or maybe respect everyone. Those kinds of general phrases, Beauvoir writes, are perfectly useless. She points out that they're useless because they are overgeneralizing, by which she means they don't give us any grounds for choosing between the manifold others that all need our help. If all men are my brothers, she writes, no particular man is my brother any longer, she notes. That is, how are you going to choose who you help or who you interact with if you technically have to deal with several billions of them? That's Beauvoir's question then, and I think it's a really good question even today. Meaningful choice, so a vague wish to be good is useless as a guide to action in the world, Beauvoir writes. Meaningful choice is only possible in specific situations. If I am transported outside of all situations, all facts seem equally indifferent to me, she notes. Right action, whether you consider that moral or political, depends on a clear view of one's own concrete historical, social, political, existential situation. And to get that clear view, you actually need to understand how the projects of others conflict or further your own. That is, you're not alone in the world having your project. the projects of others interact and conflict and backfire on them and on you in all kinds of complex ways. But this means that I need to have concrete connections to others, connections forged through common action or opposition to others. Beauvoir writes, others only exist for me if I have created connections to them, if I have made them my neighbors. They exist as allies or enemies, depending on whether my project agrees with or contradicts theirs. To create connections to people is to work with them, or to struggle against them, to love them or to hate them, but in any case to be involved with them as concrete and particular others. I mean, this is precisely what Françoise in L'Invité can't do. She doesn't know how to do that with other people. Beauvoir's wartime preoccupations remain relevant. We still face a world full of injustice, suffering, and exploitation. How do we choose among an infinity of possible projects? Should we devote our energies to feminism or to the Green Movement or perhaps to the struggle of indigenous people or maybe to the fight against racism? Or should we rather care for our aging parents, our young children, or try to improve the local schools? We learn from Beauvoir that we can't make the right choices for ourselves if we cut ourselves off from our concrete, practical relations with others. That is, to ground your choices, you look at your concrete interaction with others. You sort of understand where you are, as it were. This means, Beauvoir argues, that I don't simply need to take account of other people and their projects, but that I must realize that I actually require them. I require the response of others for my own actions to have any meaning. And I want to stress here strongly the contrast between Beauvoir's understanding of otherness in the 1940s and Sartre's. Beauvoir writes this about requiring other people for my own projects to have meaning, just about at the same time as Sartre writes No Exit with its famous punchline, hell is other people. This idea that the response of others, whether it takes the form of critique or admiration, is necessary for my own freedom to be meaningful, returns in a more developed and more Hegelian form in the second sex's concept of reciprocity, as we shall now see. So, having set up metaphysical otherness, I should say that the question here is not to move away, to deny that any of these exist. You can have metaphysical experiences of otherness, but Beauvoir's point is that can't ground any kind of politics or history or action for you. And so then she has a first pass on thinking of what it means to live in a world of ordinary others in Pyrrhus and Cineas. But then, in my view, and I'm skipping a little here because there's interesting stuff in America day by day, that particularly about race, that ought to be part of this talk, but is not. She comes to the second sex, where she sets out, and this is often overlooked, two notions of otherness. I could even make a case for three, but I'm sticking to two at the moment. Absolute otherness and reciprocal otherness. I'm going to discuss these together because they are interwoven with one another. I'm going to show that the last kind of otherness, reciprocal otherness, will be experienced differently depending on its social context or background. By that I mean that by the time I get to the reciprocal bit, there's going to be a difference whether it happens under sexism or in some amazing utopian space after sexism. I'm going to come to that. What exactly does it mean to say that woman is the other? For Beauvoir, this is not a metaphysical description because we are not back to L'Invité. Nor is it simply a statement that women are particular others. We are not denying that, but we are not back to Pyrrhus and Cineas either. It is rather a claim that one group of human beings are singled out and placed right from birth in a situation in which they are defined as others, as secondary beings, as creatures whose existence is relative to some other group. Otherness in this sense is neither a metaphysical concept, nor is it simply the existence of a particular person, but it is an ideology, or what Beauvoir calls a myth. Here I want you to be alert to the meaning of myth in France at this time comes from Lévi-Strauss's anthropology, structural anthropology, 1949, which launches the idea of mythology. Beauvoir read it in proofs when she was writing The Second Sex. And it's picked up by Roland Barthes, big time in the book Mythologies, where it becomes the foundation for what we think of as a study of ideology today, for example. So Beauvoir talks about the myths of woman, and the kind of woman is the other in the way I just talked about now is mythological, but I've also called it here absolute otherness, and I'll come to that. The otherness that characterizes the situation of women is mythological, ideological, which means it's not actually real in the sense that women aren't that, but they are being positioned and cast as absolute others. It is of a quite particular kind. Beauvoir writes that it is absolute otherness without reciprocity. She writes, woman thus appears as the inessential who never becomes the essential, as the absolute other without reciprocity. Or in other words, man is the subject or the one, woman is the other. This is Beauvoir's definition of sexism. But here you need to notice one crucial thing more. That is, there's a huge difference between this understanding of woman as the other and Hegel's master-slave dialectics that it's often been compared to. Because the master-slave dialectics, what happens is, it's reversible. So that through work and so on, the slave has become slave after a struggle to life and death. Then there's work, and the slave gains consciousness of him or herself, for Hegel it's himself, by working, and so the power relation can be reversed, overthrown. But when you say the absolute other without reciprocity, it's also implied that this power relationship never changes, and that's what it also means to say it's mythological or ideological. There's a myth that says that this can never change, as it were. To acknowledge reciprocity is to recognize that the others we are dealing with are not simply objects for me, but subjects in their own right, and as such are just as free, just as capable of action and reflection as I am. In everyday life, we often learn to see others, my colleagues, my students, my friends, my family, both as subjects and as objects, just as they, one must hope, see us both as objects and subjects. To be other to someone else in this sense is not a bad thing. It is to have one's humanity acknowledged by the other and to acknowledge their humanity in return. Note here that for Beauvoir, and Beauvoir always insists on this, it doesn't follow that we will like or support the other. It just means that we will recognize them as subjects, even if it means we hate them and see them as plotting against us. We are actually acknowledging them as subjects, you see. This is why Beauvoir is always against this idea we need to be good and sweet and kind. It won't work in real life, she thinks. If we think back to L'Invité, we can now see that Françoise is simply incapable of reciprocity. She kills Xavier because she can't bear the thought that Xavier exists for herself just as much as Françoise does. If we think back to Pyrrhus and Cineas, the notion of reciprocity adds a new dimension to the idea of needing particular others, in that it explains more thoroughly why my acts might feel ungrounded, empty, overly abstract if they occur in a world in which I can't have or close myself off to the response of others. So now we come to the distinction between reciprocity or reciprocal otherness, if you like, and absolute otherness, which is crucial to the second sex. For how can Beauvoir argue both that reciprocity is bound to arise from work and struggle with others, because that's what she says, you work with others, you live with them, they come to see you as a subject, and simultaneously that women are the absolute other. So how can we have these two together? After all, even in sexist societies, men and women often participate in common work and common projects or in collective struggles against other groups. From such relations, one might expect an acknowledgement of reciprocity to emerge. Sometimes women and men work together for a political goal, for example, is a prime case of such things. Beauvoir agreed, and here's the interesting thing, and what makes the second sex so alive for me today. Beauvoir agrees that this is the case. She says, when we interact with others in work and struggle, reciprocity is bound to arise. Sooner or later, she writes, and I'm quoting, individuals and groups will have to acknowledge the reciprocity of their relations. So it follows from that, I think, that even under sexism, some women may well be in reciprocal relationship with some men. Beauvoir has some passages which implies that. And this is a genuinely productive insight. It explains first why Beauvoir is not a so-called victim feminist. She thinks that there are cases where women, by working and struggling, are actually gaining the reciprocity, the status of reciprocal subjects. And it also explains why she remained optimistic about women's future, why she declared in 1949 that the free woman is only now being born. Because she thought that in 1949, more women were entering the workforce, more men and women were working together, working politically together, struggling together, which would lay the groundwork for genuine recognition of reciprocity. So that's the good side of the coin, right? But nevertheless, none of that makes her modify the claim that woman is the absolute other. The subtlety of her analysis is very visible here, because here she sees the complex dialectics between the general situation of women as a category in which they are cast as absolute others, and the experience of individual women, which can be extremely variable. The second sex is full of the varied experience of women, and some of those women may well experience reciprocity in relations with men. So then you can say, where does that leave us? Well, reciprocity under sexism, this is my reading of the second sex and of life, I suppose. Remember, philosophy and life are not divorced. Reciprocity under sexism is absolutely not a reliable entity. If you belong to a group cast by social norms as the absolute other, you can never count on being acknowledged as a reciprocal other. To say that a woman is the other is to say that she lives in a world in which something blocks the acknowledgement or may block the acknowledgement of reciprocity in cases where it would normally be forthcoming if the subject were a man. There are plenty of cases in which women have worked with men, shared their hardships and projects, and yet never gained recognition as their semblable, their fellow creatures, as Beauvoir puts it. This happened to women activists who had worked hard in the civil rights and anti-war movements in the 1960s, yet constantly felt that their contributions were slighted and belittled. And in the end, they left those movements and went on to found the new women's movement, to which we all owe so much today. In pointing then to the tension between women's status as absolute others and some women's experience of reciprocity, even under sexism, Beauvoir puts her finger on the fundamental contradiction of sexism, but she also explains, and this is the good thing, I mean, this is great that sexism actually is contradictory, because it explains why its hold can never be absolute. The very contradiction arising from this tension opens a space for consciousness raising and critique. Beauvoir's understanding of sexism explains why some women easily realize that they are cast as other, while others intensely deny it. Then neither of those women may be lying about their experience. It explains the contradictions of women's ordinary existence much better than most competing theories, which assumes that there's an all-encompassing discourse of power, which its victims can only subvert or ironically mimic, but never explicitly oppose. I think Beauvoir gives us a much more interesting idea of what kind of ideology sexism is and why it has gaps and contradictions that permit us to, as it were, take it apart at times. So far, then, I have discussed reciprocity under sexism. But Beauvoir also uses the term to describe the goal of feminism. So suddenly, when you read towards the end of the second sex, it looks like she's talking about a utopian thing. And I've said it's here and now, as it were. And she does both. The goal of feminism is to create a society in which men and women genuinely see each other with reciprocity as fellow creatures. Beauvoir insists over and over again on the future friendship between men and women, on a future in which the sexes work together on common projects. No theorist of otherness that I know has been so keen to stress that the goal for women's liberation has to be reciprocity between the oppressed and the group that oppresses them. What then is the difference between reciprocity under sexism and what we might call free reciprocity, maybe reciprocity achieved in a society in which we imagine sexism had disappeared? Well, under sexism, men's acknowledgement of their reciprocity with women is not ordinary. It's not quite run-of-the-mill. This means that it can't be taken for granted, and it means that it's still possible for men to feel smug and self-satisfied when they recognize women as their equals, just as women may still feel grateful for a recognition no man would feel was more than his due. So there's a kind of subtle inflection. There could also be moments where you feel it's just your due and you take it for granted, but there are also these moments where you feel, oh, how nice. Well, you really, you shouldn't have to feel that. That's the idea. In a sexist world characterized by pockets of partial opportunity for reciprocity, which is what we have today, it is often difficult to tell whether a man's dismissive behavior towards a woman is a manifestation of sexism or whether the woman actually earned his rebuff. In a non-sexist world, we would simply assume that if a man opposes a woman's projects, it's because he disagrees with her for reasons that have nothing to do with either his or her sex or gender. In the same way, a woman who receives a prestigious award today may still wonder whether she earned it or whether she was simply used as a token woman, as what the French so fittingly call a femme alibi. So the point here is the very idea of not being able to take reciprocity for granted introduces doubt where doubt ought not to be, and smugness and pride where it's not really earned. So that's one of the things I learned from a rereading of The Second Sex today. So now I'm coming to the last part of this lecture, which is called the Mastermind Lectures, What Would Simone Have Said? And this, then, as you can see now, this brings us to the question of the Mastermind Lectures. As I have already mentioned, this is the 62nd Mastermind Lecture, but only the second to deal with a woman. What would Simone have said? Would she even have wanted to be included on the list of masterminds? While Beauvoir wasn't the type to make a big fuss about inclusion or exclusion on lists of this kind, she couldn't have failed to notice that the list of masterminds demonstrates exactly what it means to say man is the one, woman is the other. You have the full list on the handout. To get a deeper understanding of the implications, I'll quote her analysis more fully. And you also have this quote on your handout. I'm just working on the first half first. Beauvoir writes, "The terms male and female only appear to be symmetrical in a purely formal way, as on town hall records and identity cards. The relation of the two sexes is not like that of two electrical poles, for man represents both the positive and the neutral, as is indicated by the common use of man to designate human beings in general. Woman appears as the negative in the sense that every definition is attributed to her as a limitation without reciprocity." To me, Beauvoir's remark that man represents both the positive and the neutral is crucial. First, and I also think this is the root of a new way of thinking about feminist theory, which I will sketch out now, and obviously will continue to work on later. First of all, the claim deepens our understanding of what it means to be cast as the absolute other without reciprocity. There aren't two equal poles. There's just the male or the masculine, which appropriates the neutral to itself, thus leaving nothing but negativity and absence for the female or the feminine. By acknowledging Beauvoir as a mastermind, we include her in a series that presents itself as neutral, in the sense that it does not explicitly care about sex and gender. You can see on the handout how it was set up. It only explicitly cares about excellence. In fact, however, the series excellence marks, in this series, excellence is heavily marked as male. Here we have reached an aspect of Beauvoir's thought that has been too little noticed before, namely that it follows from her analysis that under sexism there is no neutral or general or ungendered zone for women. There is for men, but not for women. So where women are being offered, as I will now show, a choice of sort of being imprisoned in this sex-gender prison or masquerading as something else which there is no category for, which I will now come to. If in a sexist society, man represents both the positive and the neutral, then what is left to women? Well, they can either pretend to be ungendered, which in this situation pretty much will amount to masquerading as male because the neutral is already marked as male, so that's where there's no terrain to occupy. Or they can embrace their gender prison, which Beauvoir refers to as being imprisoned in one's sex subjectivity. That's the position in which you sort of think that, whether you think this is true, if you think this is true mostly of women, you're a classical sexist. You think that women sort of ooze sex and gender from every pore, that everything a woman does is subtly feminine and female. That would be the extreme sort of traditional case. But there is another case, which I will turn to now. So if Beauvoir is right in her analysis that the neutral ground has been hijacked for the male, then what do we do? What's the road forward? In feminist theory so far, the most popular assumption has been to assume that we need to turn woman into a positive term enjoying full reciprocity with man. Woman would then no longer be the negative, no longer the particular as opposed to the general, but fully universal, fully normative in her own right. This is the solution embraced by so-called difference feminism. And difference feminism have thus sometimes argued for a world in which there are two fully gendered norms, the problem now being that the norm is male and masculine, hijacking the neutral. Therefore, what do we need? Well, we need a new fully feminine norm, is the argument. Then we get two kinds of truth, two kinds of excellence, a world in which we enthusiastically celebrate the different standards, different tradition of the two genders or sexes. In such a world, gender and sex would saturate every social space. There would simply be no neutral ground, because the whole point there is that feminists think that men have been getting away with masquerading as neutral. They must also embrace their fully gendered, sexed normativity and be oozing masculinity in everything they touch and so on. In such a world, then, there would simply be no neutral ground, whether for men or for women. There would be no space in which we might escape the stranglehold of gender for a while. Such a world, however, I submit, is also the world of sexism, as compatible with Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale as it is with Monique Wittig's Les Guerrières, but obviously with either a positive or a negative mark on them. In such a world, there would, of course, be two different lecture series, one for masterminds and another for mistress minds. The very fact that we still live in a culture in which we can't even say mistress mind without thinking of bad puns of the oh, mistress mind type, and without immediately thinking more about the sexual bodies of mistresses than about brilliant minds shows what we are up against. But difference feminism never appealed to Beauvoir. The question now is what she proposes instead. Let's take a closer look at how she reacted when she was placed in a position where she had to choose between pretending to be neutral or ungendered or claiming her femininity. And this is the rest of the same passage. I have sometimes been annoyed in the middle of an abstract discussion at hearing men say to me, "You think this or that because you are a woman." But I knew that my only defense would be to reply, "I think it because it's true. thereby removing, eliminant, my subjectivity. It would be out of the question to retort, and you think the contrary because you are a man, for it is understood that the fact of being a man is no peculiarity, or you could say particularity, if you like. We note that Beauvoir is talking about abstract discussions, not about practical issues. I assume she mentions this explicitly because she doesn't want us to conjure up situations in which one's sex would actually be a perfectly reasonable ground for claiming expertise and thus authority. I once asked the class, I was teaching this passage, and I once asked the class to imagine circumstances in which the fact of being a woman might give the speaker some claim to authority. One young man immediately spoke up and suggested that we might say, "Of course you are right about the table decorations because you are a woman." And thus he nicely illustrated Beauvoir's point, namely that you can't usually gain much authority in an abstract discussion about, say, Descartes or Kant by invoking your sex or gender. Moreover, it simply wouldn't occur to most men to present their own readings of Kant or Hegel as masculine or male. They think of their own intellectual work as unproblematically ungendered, general or neutral or universal, while they would readily agree, if asked, that of course they are men, and of course maybe today they'd even say, of course that may leave some traces here and there. They don't actually think of their own essays on philosophy as expressions of their maleness, but simply as good arguments, thought-provoking pieces of epistemology or metaphysics or whatever. As an intellectual, therefore, Beauvoir has everything to lose by acknowledging that she reads Descartes as a woman. But this is precisely what is unfair about the situation and what gives difference feminism its appeal, because this is why difference feminism comes to seem so attractive on this point. For, of course, Beauvoir reads as the woman she is. Note that I am not saying reading as a woman, that as if there were only one way that all women could read. I'm saying she reads as the woman she is, which means born into the Catholic bourgeoisie in Paris in 1908, etc., with that education and those learning experiences and so on. Anyway, but she reads as the woman she is. The unfairness here is this: why should she have to eliminate her gendered subjectivity when the men don't? The answer is that a woman's subjectivity under sexism is taken to be intrinsically sexed and gendered, shut up in that gendered prison over there, whereas the same is simply not true for men. As a result, a man's reading of, say, Descartes can contain obvious traces of his own masculinity without causing anyone to criticize him for saying what he says just because he's a man, whereas even the slightest whiff of female experience in a woman's reading of Descartes would be instantly suspect. In short, under sexism, so-called neutral or ungendered ground is far more tolerant of traces of masculinity than it is of traces of femininity. This is where the unfairness comes into it. So I think we all read as the gendered, historical, social subjects we are, including men, but there's something that happens when the femaleness becomes visible in a way that the maleness, it doesn't happen in the same way with the maleness anyway. This is to say that neutral or ungendered ground under sexism is far more tolerant of masculinity than of femininity means that this is why men can represent humanity without having to repress the sexual and sexed aspects of their existence, whereas women cannot. When under sexism, of course. And of course, again, now it sounds like I've built a phenomenally strong case for difference feminism, right? Because that sounds so plausible now. When pressed, Beauvoir chooses the neutral. She says, I say it because it's true, right? That's her choice. She chooses the neutral, or what she would call the universal. But to her, this is not a triumphant conclusion. On the contrary, it comes with an acknowledgement of loss. She has to eliminate her own subjectivity to hang on to her claim to truth. Beauvoir's dilemma is one in which women are left with an impossible choice between being imprisoned in our sex and gender. On this view, everything I do or say is marked as female or feminine, and there is no neutral ground. And having to deny it altogether, I say it because it's true, right? On this view, nothing I do or say is marked by the fact that I am a woman. For me, there's only neutral ground. But since that ground, you see, this is the kick, this is under sexism, neutral ground is already marked as male, then there is no space for my femaleness anywhere. Beauvoir's choice to go for the neutral when pressed and putting it forward as a loss, not as a victory. Beauvoir's choice made many feminists unhappy. Many theorists have labeled her an equality feminist as opposed to a difference feminist, precisely because she refuses to embrace female difference. But this is false in two ways. First of all, Beauvoir herself certainly did not deny that there are differences between women and men. I always get slightly appalled that one has to say this, because I don't know of any feminist of any stripe who has ever denied that there are differences between women and men, but never mind. While she always stressed the variability of women's experiences, she also fills the second sex with innumerable examples of sex bodies and gendered experience. But the second way in which this equality feminism versus difference feminism is a false opposition is this: the opposite of equality is not difference, it is inequality. There's no contradiction between acknowledging women's difference and insisting on their right to enjoy freedom, justice, and equality. In fact, the reason why you need to insist on a certain group's right to equality is usually that they are different in some way in the first place, otherwise the problem would not arise, as it were. So this is the major insight of my reading of Beauvoir on this level today. There is a way, she's starting to sketch out a way of being a feminist that takes us beyond the false opposition between equality and difference, as if we should have to choose between two types of feminism that aren't in fact opposed. Equality is not opposed to difference. The issue here, this is why, this is another story, but this is why I always talk about women rather than gender in certain ways, because women come in all kinds and types and forms, and you don't need a theory of women, you just need to make a space for them and then see what happens. That's why the invasion of the neutral ground for women is such an important project. Beauvoir's explicit aim was for women to gain access to the universal. This has also been taken to mean that she was a universalist as opposed to a particularist. I have some difficulty understanding exactly what that means. I mean, I have read some explanations, but I don't quite get them in relation to feminism, because I don't understand what it would mean to be a feminist without any concept of the universal, without any concept of the universal, like freedom, justice, equality. You see what I mean? So that's a philosophical debate where I obviously haven't understood something. Here I will simply say that I have come to the conclusion that what Beauvoir means when she speaks of access to the universal is for women to gain access to what you may call the general category, truth, humanity, philosophy, literature, to the ungendered and to the neutral, and to gain access to the general, the ungendered, the neutral, as the women they are, not as some kind of ungendered creature, and certainly not by conforming to some ideological norm about what women should be, but as the women they are. This is not about overcoming sex or gender. It's not about having to repress sex or gender either. It's about women gaining the freedom to speak and act with authority without having to suffer irrelevant emphasis on their gender, yet without either having to pretend that they are not women. This is the, I once wrote a paper called I Am Not a Woman Writer, where I developed, you know, the many women writers have felt that they have to say I am not a woman writer, because otherwise they get enclosed in the gender prison. In my analysis, that is, I call that I am not a woman writer. That's the speech act that I see as a response to a provocation. And the provocation is the one that I've outlined here. You say that because you're a woman. No, I say it because I'm a human being, but I am a woman. But if you're a woman, then that's all you are. So then you get fed up with that and have to say, I'm not a woman writer. But anyway, the aim here is to get to a point where you don't have to be caught in that dilemma anymore. So this is, I want to stress that in this field, which is subtle and ideological, and I don't, footnote here, I don't want to imply that this was Beauvoir's major point about feminism. Her major point about feminism was about access to financial independence, health, education, and so on. This is not something I've talked about here. But once you have that, then you also need to gain the freedom to speak and act with authority without having to suffer some irrelevant emphasis on your gender, and without having to pretend that you are not the woman you are. And in this field, we have a very long way to go. Just think of the coverage of Hillary Clinton when she ran for president in 2008 as a sort of textbook case of what it means to overly gender a woman in the public eye. Feminists need to recover the neutral and the ungendered for women, but that doesn't mean that the neutral is to be marked as female. What we need now is an energetic investigation of how women can wrench the ungendered, the neutral, and the general away from their traditional alliance with the male and the masculine in order to make such terms equally hospitable to the female and the feminine. I want to get away from the idea that the male and the neutral are one. Let's wrench the neutral out to a zone which also is hospitable for women without throwing out the men. But we haven't done that yet. Ever since Beauvoir, feminists have, of course, pointed out exactly how maleness and masculinity takes over and occupies what should be neutral ground. Why, for example, do critics only use the term the great American novel about works written by men? Why do women writers constantly get cast as women writers when the term men writers is barely used? In such cases, it seems to me that to change our language is to change our form of life, or rather, maybe we need to change our form of life to get the language to change here. The great American novel is an ostensibly neutral term which has been taken over by the male or the masculine. The mastermind lecture is an ostensibly gendered term, master, which takes itself to be neutral or universal. In practice, both turn out to provide inhospitable environments for women. Given my Beauvoirian analysis, changing the title wouldn't make much of a difference, though. Experience shows that the best way to make the ostensibly neutral or general more tolerant of the female or the feminine is by making the inclusion of women more commonplace, more ordinary. Just have enough women there for long enough, and we will stop thinking quite in the same way. The more female government ministers there are, the more ready we are to think of the ostensibly neutral but de facto male word ministers open to women too. I think we are lucky in the sense that we can no longer remember quite, or we don't know today, the shock it was the French were wondering about, should they say Madame la Ministre, or should they say Madame le Ministre? They had all kinds of debates, that the very idea, it was enough to keep women out because they didn't know what to call them. So what about then the mastermind lectures? What would Simone have said? I think she would have smiled and accepted her inclusion among the masterminds as the honor it is. Doing so wouldn't mean that she would have taken back her own analysis. She would still know what she knows about the mastermind lecture, and I hope I've just explained what she knows about it. But why not be gracious? And in this case, the only gracious thing to do is to accept a woman's designation as a mastermind as another small step on the long road towards justice, freedom, and equality for women. Thank you.